Nancy Pelosi talks race, Paul Krugman talks fascism, and President Trump talks NAFTA. So, a lot of talking. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show. I have a lot to get to today. I have a crazy story out of Brown University that really is indicative of where the left is intellectually, and it is not a good place. Well, the media keep proclaiming that Donald Trump is the scariest person who ever was. President Trump continues to bash the mainstream media. He continues to suggest that they are indeed fake news. He continued that this morning when he woke up at 5:30 in the morning and decided to rewatch Lou Dobbs. Yes, that's actually what happened. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning and he TiVos a lot of the shows on Fox News and Fox Business, and he decided to watch Lou Dobbs' show. Lou Dobbs is talking about the search results over in Google, and President Trump decided to tweet this out. This is 14. Tweet out, Google search results for Trump news shows only the viewing reporting of fake new media. In other words, they have it rigged for me and others so that almost all stories and news is bad. Fake CNN is prominent. Republican, conservative, and fair media is shut out. Illegal. 96% of results on Trump news are from national left-wing media. Very dangerous. Google and others are suppressing voices of conservatives and hiding information and news that is good. They're controlling what we can and cannot see. This is a very serious situation. Will be addressed. Okay, well, I don't think the president actually Googles things. He apparently doesn't use a computer really. So where he got this information is that Lou Dobbs is talking about search results when it comes to Google News. And it's true that the Google News bias in favor of large media organizations is pretty severe. And that does have an actual impact on the kind of news that people consume. And it does mean that they actually consume a fair bit of misinformation that is put out by the mainstream media. Now, it's important to remember that when President Trump says things like fake news and means just any news he doesn't like, he was not the originator of the phrase fake news. The originator of the phrase fake news, Trump says that he made it up. He didn't make it up. It was made up by the left. The left suggested that Hillary Clinton had lost the election, if you recall, due to fake news. There were a bunch of false stories put out on Facebook. People believed those false stories, and then they voted for Donald Trump instead of Hillary Clinton. President Trump said the actual fake news are the members of the mainstream media. And unfortunately, members of the mainstream media seem intent on proving his point almost every day. The latest example comes courtesy of CNN. So President Trump has focused on CNN incessantly, and there's a reason for that. Here's the latest example. CNN absolutely botched a story claiming that President Trump knew in advance about the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting between members of the Trump campaign and a Russian-backed lawyer supposedly offering dirt on Hillary Clinton. You know, there's been a lot of focus on this particular meeting, obviously, because in the run-up to the meeting, Donald Trump Jr. was emailing with an associate of his from Russia who's basically saying that the Russian government wants to supply the Trump campaign with dirt on Hillary, so why don't you meet with this lawyer? And Trump Jr. was like, sounds great. And then they had the meeting. Well, one of the big questions has been, did Trump know in advance about the meeting? Well, CNN reported July 26th, 2018, claiming that Trump did know in advance about the meeting. Well, it turns out the person who supplied that information was Lanny Davis, who's the Clinton-associated lawyer for Michael Cohen, who at the time was attempting to show the Mueller investigation that Michael Cohen had something valuable to offer. CNN says it stands by the story, but Davis told the Washington Post this week, quote, I should have been more clear, including with you, that I could not independently confirm what happened. I regret my error. Davis also told Anderson Cooper of CNN, I think the reporting of the story got mixed up in the course of a criminal investigation. We were not the source of the story. The CNN story originally said Davis offered no comment. It turns out that on background, he had actually provided virtually all of the story. CNN said, quote, we stand by our story. We are confident in our reporting of it. That story rocketed around the media. It was echoed by NBC News and the Washington Post. According to BuzzFeed News, Davis was the confirming source for all of that. Those admissions follow another admission from Lanny Davis, Michael Cohen's lawyer, regarding a claim that President Trump knew beforehand about the hacking of Democratic emails by the Russians. Now Davis says, quote, I am not sure. There's a possibility that is the case, but I am not sure. So the source for half of the media's news regarding Russian collusion and Trump Tower and all the rest of it is Lanny Davis, the lawyer for Michael Cohen, who has now gone on record admitting that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. CNN stands by the story anyway. According to BuzzFeed News, quote, the network, in effect, doesn't appear to believe it made a mistake. The story was, some inside CNN argue, carefully worded to hedge against those in the Cohen camp changing their tune. In other words, the story reports claim that Cohen had said he was willing to make, not the underlying truth of those claims. So in other words, CNN says, listen, we didn't report that Cohen knew that Trump had known about the Trump Tower meeting in advance. No, the CNN story reported that Cohen was willing to tell prosecutors that he might have known about that stuff. So we had carefully caveated this. Right? The decision from CNN to continue to stand by the story suggests it believes the strength of its other sources outweighs any waffling from Davis, according to BuzzFeed. or that the network believes Davis was telling the truth then and not now. But Davis's news statement that he was the source for a story he now refutes raised questions about what action, if any, the network might take. We should address Lanny Davis's comments in our reporting and be more transparent with our readers about our reporting, one CNN staffer told BuzzFeed News. Now, I have some personal experience with stories like this. So I remember back in 2013, Chuck Hagel was nominated for Secretary of Defense by the Obama administration. Chuck Hagel was, in my opinion, radically anti-Israel. He was an isolationist on foreign policy, and there was a big push from the right to stop Chuck Hagel's nomination. Well, I was supplied information by top sources in the Senate that Chuck Hagel had spoken to some group called Friends of Hamas. It was just a rumor, and we reported it on Breitbart News as a rumor. The actual title of the piece said, we called up the White House basically hung up on us, and the title of the piece was something like, White House spokesperson hangs up based on rumors of Friends of Hamas, something like that. It was pretty clear in the piece that it was a rumor. Now, that was a correctly reported rumor because it turns out that the rumor was not true. But should we have reported it in the first place? The answer is no, and I've said this multiple times since. It was a mistake not to retract the story. It was a mistake to report the story in the first place. CNN basically did the same thing here, but they're not backing off the story. Right? The same mainstream media that suggested that story was bad, and was largely right, is now suggesting that this story by CNN is kind of okay. And then President Trump complaining about fake news is labeled crazy. You have folks in the media claiming that the news media are the reliable sources in all of this. It's hard to give a lot of credibility to news sources that hold a double standard when it comes to people on the right. They would never hold for people on the left. And the levels to which the media will go in order to disparage and slander the Trump administration are pretty astonishing. It's mostly astonishing because if they would just be accurate about the Trump administration, it's not like they would have nothing to report. But the opinions of the left are so out of the realm of normalcy that it's almost impossible to defend. Take, for example, this column from Jill Filipovich. This is not an objective news piece. This is a column. But Jill Filipovich is a feminist author, and she is the author of a book called The H Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness, which the book is completely blank. There is no feminist pursuit of happiness. It's just like Michael Knowles' book. So Jill Filipovich writes a piece called Stormy Daniels, Feminist Hero. And this is how far the left is willing to go. Stormy Daniels, a porn star who spends her entire career legitimately catering to the worst in men, is now a feminist hero for having sex with a married man once in order to get on The Apprentice, and then taking money to shut up about it, and then reneging on the taking of the money to shut up about it, to make a big deal about it. She's a feminist hero. Here's Jill Filipovich, quote, "Let's take a moment for Stormy Daniels. On Tuesday, Michael Cohen pled guilty to breaking campaign finance laws, charges stemming from payments he made to two women, one of them Miss Daniels, with whom Donald Trump is said to have had an affair. Mr. Cohen, a former lawyer for Mr. Trump, says he made the payments at the direction of the president in an effort to influence the 2016 election. It's an extraordinary admission and an extraordinary political moment, not just because of what it means for Mr. Trump. It marks an unanticipated feminist turning point. Miss Daniels is an adult film star and, like the president, an unapologetic self-promoter. Hers is not a female archetype that has historically garnered much respect, trust, or sympathy." Well, yeah, because she legitimately gets paid to have sex on film so that other men can masturbate to it. That is legitimately her career. So yeah, I wouldn't go with feminist archetype there. Yet here she is, an imperfect, entirely self-possessed woman telling her story with clarity and without shame. And here we are actually listening to her. Okay, let's be clear. The only reason anybody's listening to her is because, one, prurient interest, and two, she's saying crap about a president that the left hates. This is why there's so much power in the fact that Miss Daniels does not believe her job or her involvement with Mr. Trump or the payoff is her shame to carry. She wants him held accountable, and the justice system is actually stepping in. She is refusing to slink away, despite being paid to do exactly that in a pattern we've seen too many times from influential men seeking to maintain their dominance and avoid responsibility. Did I miss something here? I thought Stormy Daniels was paid to voluntarily go away and signed a contract to that effect. Was she forced into anything here? I missed that part. So, just to be clear, when you violate a contract, that's good and feminist, so long as it hurts Donald Trump. Jill Filipovich writes, Miss Daniels is a sex worker, making her the kind of bad woman scorned for her work, who is often not believed when she indicts a powerful man. Well, her work is garbage, and when she, quote, indicts a powerful man, we sort of have to decide whether or not she is credible. Her credibility is not really called into question by the fact that she's a porn star. She's not even claiming she was sexually assaulted or harassed. She's claiming that she had sex with a guy once and then won't shut up about it before an election, right? That's legitimately her entire claim. But this makes her a feminist hero. In a second, we will talk about the feminist heroism of a woman who does girl-on-girl scenes for pay, which says the left is celebrating Stormy Daniels as a hero. And the reason that I cite this is because while the opinion pages in the New York Times objective news pages are separate, the reality is that they're not quite all that separate. Okay, the same media sensibility that informs an editorial page that thinks Jill Filipovich has relevant things to say about Stormy Daniels being a feminist hero, they're the same folks who are pushing bad news over at CNN. The hard distinction between opinion and journalism doesn't really exist. Okay, it's why we over at the Daily Wire admit what our biases are, but the objective news media at places like CNN will not admit that bias. Instead, they claim they're objective truth tellers, when in reality, most of them feel like Jill Filipovich does. Anyway, Filipovich continues. She says, Ms. Daniels' lack of shame about her line of work has led to a right-wing escalation, with conservative media outlets hounding her as a prostitute once they realized she would meet porn star with a shrug. Well, I mean, no, people were calling her kind of a prostitute because she was kind of a prostitute. Like, I mean, just like having sex on film for pay is not markedly better than having sex not on film for pay. Rudy Giuliani, one of Mr. Trump's lawyers, said in June, although he respects all human beings, Ms. Daniels is apparently one exception. He said, I don't respect a porn star the way I respect a career woman or a woman of substance or a woman who has great respect for herself as a woman and as a person, he said, and isn't going to sell her body for sexual exploitation. So Stormy, you want to bring a case, let me cross-examine you. The threat is that Mr. Giuliani would do to Ms. Daniels what lawyers have done for centuries to imperfect women, and in particular, rape victims. Okay, how is a feminist equating a woman who has sex for money on film for the pleasure of men with a rape victim? How is that even a possibility? You want to know the most anti-feminist thing that I've heard today? It is this. Okay, it is not anything that Rudy Giuliani said. It's something I'm saying right now. The most anti-feminist thing you can say is that Stormy Daniels is akin to a rape victim in any way. She is not a rape victim. She is a woman who voluntarily has sex for money. Again, none of this is to let President Trump off the hook for stooping women who have sex for money, which he does apparently on a fairly regular basis. But the left attempts to paint everyone who is anti-Trump as some sort of great hero in the struggle. I don't think it's going to redound to their benefit in the long run. Filipovich says, Mr. Giuliani contrasted Ms. Daniels with three beautiful women, classy women, women of great substance, who Mr. Trump has married, perfectly encapsulating the profoundly misogynist virgin-whore dichotomy imposed on women, where we can only be perfectly good or entirely bad. Well, no, women can be flawed, but if you choose to do what Stormy Daniels does, that comes along with some character consequences. It's pretty insane that this article was considered brilliant enough to make the pages of the New York Times, but this is where we are. This is where we are. So this is just great stuff. Stormy Daniels, heroine. That's not the only element of stupidity in the pages of the New York Times. The New York Times also features today a piece by Paul Krugman, who is one of the appointed idiots over at the New York Times. Krugman knows something about international currency. He knows nothing about virtually anything else. So he has a piece today in the New York Times talking about how Donald Trump is ushering in the era of fascism. He says, why it can happen here, we are very close to becoming another Poland or Hungary. He says, soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a friend of mine, an expert on international relations, made a joke. Now that Eastern Europe is free from the alien ideology of communism, it can return to its true historical path, fascism. Even at the time, his quip had a real edge. As of 2018, it hardly seems like a joke at all. What Freedom House calls illiberalism is on the rise across Eastern Europe. This includes Poland and Hungary, both still members of the EU, in which democracy as we normally understand it is already dead. In both countries, the ruling parties, Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary, have established regimes that maintain the forms of popular elections, but have destroyed the independence of the judiciary, suppressed freedom of the press, institutionalized large-scale corruption, and effectively delegitimized dissent. The result seems likely to be one-party rule for the foreseeable future. This is correct, by the way. The situation in Hungary and Poland is not a good one. Okay, a lot of the moves toward liberalism in the aftermath of the communist collapse has been replaced by a move toward one-party rule in quasi-fascist mode. Jamie Kirchhoff has a great book on this called The End of Europe that I've recommended on the show before, and he talks specifically about the situations in places like Poland and Hungary. But here's where Krugman goes wrong. He says, it could all too easily happen here. There was a time not long ago when people used to say our democratic norms, our proud history of freedom, would protect us from such a slide into tyranny. In fact, some people still say that, but believing such a thing today requires willful blindness. The fact is that the Republican Party is ready, even eager, to become an American version of Law and Justice or Fidesz, exploiting its current political power to lock in permanent rule. Okay, this column is going to look really stupid when and if the Democrats win back the House in 2018, the Senate in 2020, and the presidency in 2020. This idea that one-party rule is on the horizon here, that that's the next thing that's happening, is just utterly baseless. There is no evidence for it whatsoever, and Krugman tries to cite a few situations in which Republicans have moved to strip particular public officials of of power. For example, North Carolina, where after a Democrat won the governorship, Republicans passed legislation stripping the governor's office of power. Okay, that's why they still have a legislature in North Carolina. But in any case, he suggests that what's happened is that the Republicans have moved toward fascism. They've moved toward the Hungary-Poland model. Now, I will acknowledge that the populism of Donald Trump is a lot more akin to right-wing nationalist parties in Europe than it is to traditional Republican principles in many ways. In terms of his actual governance, however, his actual governance has been small government conservatism, except when it comes to a lot of spending proposals. So Trump talks like a right-wing European nationalist. There's no question about that. But when it comes to policy, that's not quite the same thing. We have a system of checks and balances in the United States that directly cuts against this sort of assumption of power. Also, Krugman goes out of his way to ignore a lot of the conditions that led to the rise of those right-wing parties in Europe. Kirchhoff talks about in that book, End of Europe, why it is that all these right-wing parties have risen. And there are a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is the politically correct attempt to rewrite history in certain ways that led to a severe backlash in a lot of these countries. And the second is a forcible attempt to impose bars on discussion about things like immigration. So one of the reasons that you've seen, for example, the Swedish Democrats, which is a more right-wing party in Sweden, start to gain all sorts of power, is because there was a forcible attempt in Sweden to quash any serious discussion about the influx of immigrants from the Middle East into Sweden. That led to a serious backlash and small fringe parties suddenly gaining a lot of prominence. You've seen that happen across Europe. In other words, the left-wing attempt to stifle discussion has actually led to a move toward a more authoritarian form of government in various areas of Europe. And yet that's exactly what the left seeks to do on a routine basis here in the United States. Krugman says that all the principles of the Republican Party are gone, and it's just because they lost their principles. He says, why is America, the birthplace of democracy, so close to following the lead of other countries that have recently destroyed it? Don't tell me about economic anxiety. That's not what happened in Poland, which grew steadily through the financial crisis and its aftermath, and it's not what happened here in 2016. Study after study has found that racial resentment, not economic distress, drove Trump voters. No, what those studies actually found is that resentment at a left that castigated people on the right as cultural outsiders is what drove Trump to victory. Okay, this idea that it was purely issues of race is nonsense. What it really was cultural anxiety about a left that was championing the idea that America was changing for the better because all of the people in the middle of the country were being marginalized, that white blue-collar workers in Ohio were being marginalized, and the press was cheering that on as a grand victory of the leftist vision. That has driven a lot of people into the arms of a sort of toxic populism that is quite bad in rhetoric. But the United States is a lot more robust in its defenses against those sort of things than Europe is, number one. And number two, the left refuses to acknowledge its own culpability in helping to bring about the rise of exactly that sort of populism, which, by the way, is mirrored by a populism on the left from people like Bernie Sanders. And I'll give you an example of the sort of political correctness that is taking over the left. This is an amazing example. So, over at Brown University, there was a study. I'm arguing here that political correctness has helped drive a populist backlash that is not good for the country. I don't think the populist backlash is great for the country, but I think the political correctness is even worse for the country. And so what we've seen is a toxicity in politics that is led by an attempt to quash debate, not just about terrible, horrible, no good, very bad ideas, but about mainstream ideas. I'm talking about mainstream scientific investigation is being forcibly quashed by the forces of political correctness on the left. Today's example is particularly insane. It comes courtesy of Brown University. So Brown University has now pulled down a news story on a study conducted by one of its own researchers. The study focused on what it described as rapid onset gender dysphoria. Okay, gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder, transgenderism, that was not present in early youth. Because this wasn't a kid who was 3 and said, I'm a little boy when it was a little girl. Instead, it was gender dysphoria that manifested within days or weeks in teens and young adults. In other words, it's become trendy in some areas of the world for people to declare themselves transgender. And you've seen this in the statistics. The number of people in Britain who have reported themselves to basically institutes that help deal with transgenderism has doubled in the course of 1 year. Don't tell me that evolution radically shifted in the course of 1 year, or that there were this many people who are transgender who just realized it in the last year, that they'd felt this way since they were 3, but now that they watched it on TV, they finally realized that this was happening. As I say, when it comes to human behavior, a large component of human behavior is indeed biological, and a huge component of human behavior is biological responses to environment. Environment does matter when it comes to all sorts of behavior. It's so funny, the left will acknowledge this when it comes to things like IQ, that IQ is indeed responsive to a certain extent to environment. They'll deny that IQ even exists with regard to biology, which is bizarre, or at least they'll make the case that biological studies with regard to IQ should not be done because we can't look at the biology of IQ, but we certainly should pretend that all sexual behavior is innately biological, and therefore, if you have a drive toward a sexual behavior, this means that you were born this way, right? This is the Lady Gaga case about biology. The reality of the reality is that human behavior is quite malleable, particularly in the sexual arena. And one of the things that has happened with regard to transgenderism is as it becomes more prominent in the media, there are more and more people who are being confused. There are more and more people who believe that because they feel like outsiders, this must mean that they actually are outsiders in their own body. And that's essentially what this study was positing. What the study author is a woman named Lisa Littman. I assume that she's on the left because she works at Brown. I can't imagine that she's not. She's an assistant professor of the practice of behavioral and social sciences at Brown's School of Public Health. And she stated, quote, "This kind of descriptive study is important because it defines a group and raises questions for more research. One of the main conclusions is that more research needs to be done." You can tell, by the way, that she doesn't like the conclusions of her own study when she keeps saying more research needs to be done. Just descriptive studies aren't randomized controlled trials. You can't tell cause and effect. You can't tell prevalence. It's going to take more studies to bring in more information, but this is a start. So what exactly was the study? Here's what the study found. Littman talked to 250 parents of children who suffered from rapid onset gender dysphoria. According to Science Daily, among the noteworthy patterns, Littman found in the survey data, 21% of parents reported their child had one or more friends become transgender identified at around the same time. 20% reported an increase in their child's social media use around the same time as experiencing gender dysphoria symptoms. 45% reported both. So in other words, a large minority of parents who were surveyed about kids who, when they're 13, suddenly realize that they are, quote unquote, of the opposite gender. A huge percentage of those kids were being influenced by their peers. Right? A huge percentage of them were having peers who decided they were transgender, and now, okay, my best friend is transgender, so maybe that means I'm transgender. And a huge percentage of them were on social media more, reveling presumably in transgender media coverage. The pattern of clusters of teens in friend groups becoming transgender identified, the group dynamics of these friend groups, and the types of advice viewed online led Littman to the hypothesis that friends and online sources could spread certain beliefs, which is common sense, and which is something that folks on the right have been saying, that when you have a society that pushes certain messages about sexuality, it actually has an impact on how people behave sexually, which we have known forever. Okay, it's true with regard to porn habits. It is true with regard to homosexuality. It is true with regard to transgenderism. It is true with regard to every sort of type of sexual experimentation. The more exposure a certain practice gets in the media, the more people are going to try it out. And that's not saying there's not a biological component to transgenderism. Perhaps there is. I assume that there probably is, particularly in young kids. It's not even assuming there's not a biological component to, it's certainly not assuming there's not a biological component to homosexuality. Particularly when it comes to twin studies, it shows there is a biological component, although the idea that it's completely biological is belied by the fact that even in twin studies, about 50% of twins are disparate, meaning if you have genetically identical twins, only about 50% of them are both gay. Right? If one's gay, the other one half the time is straight, which would suggest it's not completely biological since they have the same DNA. Examples. So what are these beliefs that are being promulgated by media? Examples include the belief that non-specific symptoms, such as feeling uncomfortable in their own skins or feeling like they don't fit in, which could be part of normal puberty or associated with trauma, should be perceived as gender dysphoria. In other words, the media and friends constantly saying, you feel uncomfortable in your own skin, or you were, God forbid, raped, something terrible happened to you, and now you feel uncomfortable sexually. Maybe it's because you're actually a member of the opposite gender. What other beliefs? The belief that the only path to happiness is transition, which is something that the media push nonstop. Okay, nonstop the media push this idea that if you're uncomfortable in your own skin, the only possible solution is hormone treatment and to mutilate your genitals. The belief that anyone who disagrees with the teen is transphobic and should be cut out of their life. Right? This is another one of the areas that if you are a teen, and you go to your parents and you say, Mom, I'm actually a boy and you're a girl. And your parents say, no, sweetheart, I know that you're having a tough time right now. Let's go talk to a psychologist. That this means your parent is transphobic and hates you. And it's something that's being pushed also. This is what the study says. Of the parents who provided information about their child's friendship group, about a third responded that more than half of the kids in the friendship group became transgender identified. More than half the kids in a particular transgender group became transgender identified. In other words, there's a certain psychological contagion that pertains to sexual experimentation and gender experimentation, which is exactly what you would figure because cliques have existed in schools for a very long time. Any trend that exists in a public school, in any school setting, is going to bring people within that clique. Hey, how is it that you get kids to dress like idiot goths? All you have to do is get a couple of kids to dress like idiot goths, and then all their friends dress like idiot goths. Okay, the same thing holds true when you have a media that is glorifying Caitlyn Jenner as Woman of the Year. A group with 50% of its members becoming transgender identified represents a rate that is 70 times the expected prevalence for young adults. 70 times, according to Littman. Okay, this is the Brown University researcher. Additionally, 62% of parents reported their teen or young adult had one or more diagnoses of a psychiatric disorder or neurodevelopmental disability before the onset of gender dysphoria. So in other words, we already know about comorbidity between depression and gender dysphoria. The idea here is that it's possible that other mental conditions are translating themselves over to gender dysphoria thanks to peers in the group who are suggesting that this is probably the solution to whatever difficulty that you're having in life. 48% reported their child had experienced a traumatic or stressful event prior to the onset of gender dysphoria, including being bullied, sexually assaulted, or having their parents get divorced. So in other words, when you have troubled kids, they are more likely to experience what this researcher calls rapid onset gender dysphoria. So what did the left do with this study? Did they say, okay, well, let's look at the data. Maybe we should drill down. Maybe we should go ahead and do further research on this. Maybe we should take a look at the fact that rates of gender dysphoria are rapidly multiplying across the West, Australia, Great Britain, Canada, the United States. It's happening everywhere. Why is this happening? Is it because there's a sudden biological shift in human genomes? Or is it possible that environmental and social conditions actually make a difference with regard to sexual behavior and identification? Instead of doing that, Brown University had a different solution.